Good morning, and thank you for joining us at the Free Market Foundation's launch of the 2020 Economic Freedom of the World Index and Report. This is something we host every year with the Fraser Institute. My name is Jane Boccaleone. I'm the Free Market Foundation's Media and Communications Manager. So today we'll be analysing the important question of how does South Africa rank in this index and why is it important? But first, let's understand a bit about what economic freedom is and why it's important in all of our lives. Economic freedom is the difference between poverty and prosperity, between first world and third world living standards and lifestyles, between good and deficient healthcare, between quality and inferior education, between living to a good old age and dying prematurely, between gender equality and downtrodden women. So it's important. It's also the difference between employment opportunities and a life without work, between the rule of law and despots. So I think we'll all agree that economic freedom matters. And it's produced, the Economic of the World Report is produced by the Fraser Institute in cooperation with the Economic Freedom Network, a group of independent research and educational institutes across nearly 100 countries and territories. So I'd now like to introduce our key speaker, FMF founder and CEO, Louw has been active in diverse aspects of South African public life for over a generation. He is credited with having a significant impact on the course of events in South Africa, especially regarding extensive economic reforms and that took place during the last 2 decades of apartheid and the inclusion of the property rights in the Constitution. And in doing this, he worked with Cyril Ramaphosa. Since 1994, he's been active in influencing economic and government policy, including creating an initiative to restore property rights through titling for Black people disposed of their land and homes. This is called the Free Market Foundation's Kaalam My Home project. With his wife, Frances Kendall, he was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize for proposals made in their book, South Africa, The Solution, which is from the Free Market Foundation. So, Leon, may we bring you in?
Yes, it's my pleasure to be with you, and it's a delight to be able to introduce the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And we're going to start with defining economic freedom. It is a decades-long exercise of research done by leading economists and policy analysts to come up with a way to classify countries' economies. That was done during the 1980s. And then in over 100 countries, or nearly 100 countries, there are institutes, of which the Free Market Foundation is one, that participate in producing this index. And the index is itself applicable to 162 countries. And economic freedom is defined in a shorter way than you'd done it, more elaborately, Jane, as the extent to which property is protected and people are free to exchange and interact voluntarily. So economic freedom is really about freedom as far as economic activity is concerned. The index consists of 42 policy issues published and produced objectively and independently by other organizations such as the World Bank and many others. There is nothing subjective in this, nothing which we decide or value. This is all based on independent indices. And the whole index can be freely downloadable along with the full data set, which is immense and massive, at the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom website. Now, what is economic freedom? It is broken down into 5 areas. The first is the size of government. How big is government? That's how big is government in all its forms. And you can think of that in many ways. How many people are employed by the government? What is the government share of the GDP? What is the government share of capital formation? How much tax does the government take as a proportion of total taxation? That would be a definition of the size of government. Then there is a sound legal system. A free economy is one in which you can enforce contracts, protect your property rights, where there's an independent judiciary that enforces the law, applies the rule of law, is consistent, in other words, uses precedent, makes the same judgment regardless of who the people before it are, and that upholds the Constitution and the laws, including common law. Then there is the sound monetary system. Money must be stable, inflation low, and if you have sound money, then people can transact. Obviously, if inflation is high, money values are leaping around, are unstable, then it is very difficult for people to transact. So sound money is the fourth. And then the fifth one is freedom to trade, mainly internationally, including freedom from exchange control, the right of people, money, and goods to move across borders internationally, or what might be called soft borders. And then finally, the fifth criterion is that there must be freedom from regulation. That really means internal regulation. Is the economy free from controls, from red tape? Can people freely enter into and leave business? Can people freely form alliances and companies and contracts and do joint ventures? That determines how free the economy is internally. So then if we move on to where does South Africa rank in all of this? This is the big question. How are we doing this year? I can tell you that in the past we did very badly, but this year we are up. We have become a more free economy according to those independent indices, at least in this last year. For the previous decade, we were moving downwards in the wrong direction. Now, many people will say, how can this possibly be? Because everything that one thinks about in South Africa has shown an increase in government intervention, a reduction of economic freedom. The answer is that it is because of these complex indices internationally published and compiled, and much of that information is submitted to people like the World Bank and the IMF and the World Economic Forum by our government. Some of it is gathered by surveys, but nonetheless, the indices show that South Africa has become somewhat freer and has moved up the ladder. I'll get to the actual freedoms in a moment, from 101st to 90th this year out of 162 countries. So for the first time in a long time, we have some good news. It's not as good as that big jump might seem, because some other countries have moved down below us. Our move up is actually quite small, as we'll see in a moment. In 2000, South Africa was the 58th freest economy in the world and went down to the 101st. In other words, we dropped precipitously on the index, and we're now nudging slowly upwards again, which would be a good thing. The 10 freest economies on earth are Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, USA, Australia, and Mauritius. Please note Mauritius is one of the African countries, is now the 7th freest economy on earth, Georgia, Canada, and Ireland. And then the 10 least free economies on earth, note how many of them sadly are in Africa: Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, Republic of Congo, Algeria, Iran, Angola, Libya, Sudan, and Venezuela. And then there are some countries for which there are no data. They typically are the dictatorships like Cuba and Korea, so they are not ranked. They would be less free than the bottom three. Then our BRICS partners, the BRICS countries, how do we compare with them? You can see that Russia is a freer economy than South Africa, 89th. Then comes South Africa in between it and India. We, of course, are 90. India, 105. Brazil, 105, same as India. And then there's China at 124. Now, you might say immediately, but hold on, that doesn't make sense. How come the Chinese economy and the Indian economy are such enormous successes with high growth rates? The answer we can provide, for example, if you go to China, it is because of their large and very prosperous free zones, special economic zones, or SEZs as they are called. They are, in fact, the freest economies on earth. So although China, on average, has a low ranking, China's real economic prosperity and growth and investment is in 7 zones, which are the freest economies on earth. In other words, China completely supports the economic freedom of the world index that shows that freer economies outperform less free economies. And China has lots of other things like free ports and special zones and export processing zones, technical and economic hubs, all of which are substantially freer than almost anything else on earth. And that is where basically all China's prosperity comes from. Now, if we look at our scores against those 5 categories I showed you, you can see that South Africa, on average, at the top, has improved and has gone from 6.61 to 6.73. 10, by the way, would be a completely free economy. 0 would be a completely unfree economy. So the higher your score, the more free you are. We've moved a little. It's a small move, but nonetheless, it's the first time in a long time that we've moved in the correct direction, and that is very good news. You can see that our government size has got smaller according to the international data, the World Bank figures, and that our legal system has improved slightly, which is very good news for people who feel that our legal system has been a disappointment. I would remind people that the Constitutional Court rules more commonly against the government for it, which is one of the great tributes to South Africa. People think when the court rules against the government, we should lament. In fact, it's a reason to celebrate. And then our money has become slightly more sound and stable. Our inflation rates are towards the lower rather than the higher ends of the targets. And then the one where we have lost ground is freedom to trade, exchange control, international movement of people, money, and goods has become slightly less free. And then freedom from regulation, we've become slightly more free. That, for people like me who study this very closely, is a peculiar one, and it's based on things like the World Bank Doing Business Index, which measures how long it takes people to register a lawful business, and other sources. But nonetheless, I'm surprised by seeing that a deluge of new laws and regulations in the last few years has nonetheless left us with a very slightly freer index according to the international measurements. And we don't query them, we simply accept them as they are. This is South Africa compared to other African countries. You can see that Mauritius is right at the top, one of the freest economies on earth. And then we have other economies that are freer than South Africa. Some time ago, 10 years ago or so, the only one freer than South Africa was Botswana. And since then, other African countries have overtaken us. The shining star is Rwanda, which has moved from one of the least free economies of the world right up the ladder to almost where South Africa used to be and is prospering. That is important to understand. Countries prosper if they move in the correct direction. So these countries are reforming towards more freedom, and even if they are not free by international standards, their direction of movement is what determines that they will prosper, and that is what they are doing. Other African countries are catching up to South Africa, and one by one they are overtaking us as we move in the wrong direction, or this year for the first time slightly in the correct direction. And then if we look at how this compares with per capita income, that's the average person's income in the world. And you can see on the left, the lowest quartile, that's all the world's countries divided into 4. You can see that they are the poorest people in the world, and on the right, the freest economies in the world have the richest people in the world on average. We'll see in a moment also how that compares to the poorest people in different countries, the poorest 10%. For example, are the poorest 10% in rich countries richer than the poorest 10% in poor countries? The answer is yes. They are, in fact, richer than the rich people in poorer countries. And you can see there it's virtually 8 times wealthier per person if you live in a free economy. And this here is probably the most exciting for me statistic of all. Most countries in the world have been getting freer in the last 2 decades. There's been an increase in economic freedom. And you can see that as soon as it set in, the amount of people in extreme poverty, the bottom, the blue, started declining from about 30% to now less than 5%. In other words, absolute destitution, extreme poverty is virtually eliminated on Earth and remains only in the very unfree countries, the ones that have not yet started becoming more free. The people not in extreme poverty have grown spectacularly, and this is one of the great pieces of news for the world. Older viewers of this will recall that when we watched television programs 20, 25, 30 years ago, actually say 40 years ago, commonplace and movie clips were seeing people literally starving to death in many countries, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Chad, and elsewhere. Now, young people have actually never seen a truly starving human being. Starvation to death has virtually disappeared from the planet, thanks to increased economic freedom around the planet. Oh, part of that economic freedom, I should mention, is simply trade, that people in poor countries can buy cell phones and can buy refrigerators and motorized transport and watches and glasses and that sort of thing, so that free trade is what brings the miracles of free markets to even the poorest and least free countries. Then if we look at life expectancy, this is important because less free economies are often presumed to have better healthcare. They're presumed to have governments, more socialistic governments doing more for the people. But the least socialistic countries, the ones where governments do less for the people, are the ones where people live longer. As the Nobel economist Friedrich Hayek put it, governments can do more for their people by doing less. And this shows you that probably the single most important thing of all, how long people live, which is also the way of knowing how healthy they are, is in freer economies where there's more healthcare in the private sector. You have the longest life expectancy and the healthiest people. This year just compares Botswana, the top line, to South Africa. Botswana has, from the beginning, been the freest economy in Africa. It's now been overtaken by Mauritius. And for some reason, under Sir Seretse Khama, it embarked on relatively free market policies. And you can see how free it is compared to South Africa. What is the consequence of that for prosperity and growth in these countries? Well, this shows you that Botswana grew at spectacular rates. South Africa's economy really since the 1970s has essentially stagnated. It went down, then it grew a bit during the early apartheid years when we got more economic freedom. Then it stagnated again during the Zuma years and started slightly declining. Botswana, on the other hand, remained free, and you can see how it prospered. We in South Africa could have been as wealthy as Botswana if we simply kept our economy as free as Botswana. Bearing in mind, Botswana is a small landlocked nation, a neighbor of ours. It does have some mineral wealth, quite a lot, but that's not what explains it. Mineral wealth in unfree countries do not get them to prosper, like Venezuela, for example, has oil but is yet one of the poorest and least free economies on earth. So that is what would have happened to South Africa had we been as free as Botswana. You can see it started off less prosperous than we are and then simply overtook us and soared ahead. This is what South Africa would have looked like had we averaged growth rates of the kind that you have in free economies, high growth economies, of 7% per annum. And 7% is an interesting rule. If you grow at 7%, the number doubles, wealth doubles every decade. Every 10 years, you are twice as rich. In 20 years, you are 4 times as rich if you grow at 7%. So 7% growth compared to ours, which is virtually zero, shows what has happened in South Africa. The bottom line, you can see that we went up after the end of apartheid. That starts in 1994. And then we started going down when we started lose economic freedom again, whereas where we would have been in South Africa is $28,000 per person. We're talking about 300,000 or so rand, compared to what we now have, which is just about between $5,000 and $6,000. So South Africa has stagnated and would have been now one of the world's wealthy countries if, since 1994, we had adopted free market policies. Now, what are the lessons for South Africa from the Economic Freedom of the World Index? Well, they are very simple, that we've suffered stagnation because we moved away from being economically free. We grew when we moved towards more economic freedom up the ladder. And now we have the devastation caused by the COVID lockdown. This is something that's completely astounding, that the government seemed to be uncaring about the devastation it would inflict on South Africans. And just bearing in mind that a lower per capita GDP, which we now have due to the lockdown, kills people. People live longer when countries are richer. We've seen that graph. And what we will now see is more people dying as a result of the decline in our economy due to lockdown than would ever have died from COVID. In other words, economic contraction and decline and lockdown kill more people than the disease. This is a classic case of the cure being worse than the disease. If we move up the index, the lesson for South Africa is just move up the index. What Cyril Ramaphosa and the Parliament and the portfolio committees must do, the government departments, is simply take a copy of the index and say, how do we increase our score on every one of these 42 categories or the 5 groupings of those categories? The Treasury and Minister Mboweni did propose 2 years ago various reforms which would have taken us up the index. And in fact, having read their proposals, it seemed as if they might well have been doing just that, studying it and saying, how do we improve our score? They spoke about transformation through small business, not about transformation through racial policies, which was interesting, that the best way to improve people's lives is to get them into business, to get them jobs, to get them goods and services, to raise their living standards. Look at raising everyone's living standard instead of redistributing the existing wealth in a static economy, baking more cakes instead of giving everyone a slice of a smaller cake. And that the Treasury understood. It also spoke about radical red tape reduction. Now, that would have been fantastic, but unfortunately, virtually none of that has happened. On the contrary, as we speak before Parliament, there are measures to increase red tape rather than reduce it. And so that this is the talk, not the walk. They are talking the talk, cut red tape, but not walking the walk by actually doing it. We need to get government rhetoric to become government action. And then they proposed modernizing network industries. Very good. Network industries are rails and roads and telecommunications and shipping and so on. And they certainly need modernizing, but we don't do so badly. Our railways have become a disaster. They could be modernized by the very simple means of having private trains on our rails, the way we have private cars on our roads and private planes in our airports and private ships in our harbors. Just do the same with rails. And in fact, it seems as if that's very much what they had in mind. They proposed, for example, that rail, telecom, all of these should be subjected to competition. Very, very good idea. Power, for example. competition in electricity supplies, then we wouldn't be suffering blackouts, or what are euphemistically called load shedding. And so they had all the right ideas that would have moved us up the index, but unfortunately just didn't do so. Pretty much everything else in the report almost would have been a move up the economic freedom index, would have made South Africa more free. However, the Treasury itself, the department that proposed these measures, proposed the sound economic policy for all other government departments, did not apply it to itself, which is odd. It didn't say, for example, it is going to lower the tax rates. It is going to lower the cost to the economy of the annual budget. On the contrary, it increased it and increased debt, which is very serious. So the Treasury had good ideas for everyone else, but it was sparse on good ideas for itself. And it is actually the most important place to start. If you are going to improve economic freedom, the place to start is the Treasury and its budget. So the bottom line is that if you overburden the economy with licenses and taxes and controls and officials and fees, then you stop productive citizens from making progress. That then is what we conclude from the Economic Freedom of the World Index, is that it is an index that tells countries in the world how to prosper, including South Africa. And if we follow the index, we will become the prosperous country we would have been had we done so after 1994. Jane,
Leon,
over
thank
to
you
you.
very
Are there
much.
any questions?
Yes, there are. Thank you very much, Leon. That's a comprehensive overview of what's in the Economic Freedom of the World Index and how South Africa stands. I do have quite a few questions. Please, people who are listening at home or in the office, send your questions. You can send them via Facebook or WhatsApp Gail Day. I think you have her number. So let's start with some questions. One has just come in now from your slides. It's from an FMF member and researcher. What are the chances that the Mboweni proposals will be accepted?
Yes, that's a, a very good question. I think Mboweni himself is still optimistic and said something recently about it. But there are, of course, these two big, powerful factions in government. The anti-Mboweni Ramaphosa group, and then those who are more to the left or more socialistic. And the pro-market group at the moment have probably the slight edge. So what the chances of them being implemented are probably low, but this is where the Free Market Foundation comes in. This is our job. Our job is to increase the chances. We do that by publishing and promoting Economic Freedom of the World Index and all the other work that our very splendid staff do. We do amazing work, and that work has to be constantly fed through to government in response to all bad policy proposals in support of all good ones. And we need to do, as we very often do, appear before portfolio committees arguing the free market argument. So the chances of Mboweni's, or we call it that, but it's really the Treasury's proposals being accepted, are probably modest, I would say, slightly above 50%. And we can increase that percentage by our work, and that's what we do.
That's great. Thank you, Leon. If the questioner would like to expand on that, please do post a Facebook question. Leon, another question that's come in is how can the metric for the size of government, how can this have improved when the fiscal situation has worsened?
Yes, this is a puzzle, and to get to the bottom of such a question is a very big research exercise. I did spend a few hours trying to make sense of the underlying indices, just bearing in mind that in this index, We do not have our own opinion on anything. We simply take the internationally published data, and that is important because we can never be accused of manipulating the index or cherry picking. And that particular, most of the numbers regarding the size of government come from the World Bank. And the World Bank has, for some reason, reached the conclusion that the size of the South African government by various measures, taxation as a proportion of GDP, economically active people as a proportion of the economically active population working for government, that the absolute size of government relative to the size of the private sector has declined. I think that all of us will wonder how that is, and the only way to know that is to delve into the very deep and complex and sophisticated underlying indices, in this case, mostly the World Bank, but also others, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, and other sources. Now, in the index, there is a detailed description of all the sources used, and it's freely downloadable over the internet. Anyone can look at all of the sources that go into it and can then delve into any one of them. For example, the size of government has various components. I should imagine it's about 6 or 7. I can't say precisely. You would have to look at each one of those components and why the aggregate of those components shows a slight reduction in the size of government. That is a complex question. It is a puzzle, and it's something I tried myself to work out how that happened.
Thank you, Leon. Questions are coming in quite thick and fast now. One from a journalist. Our biggest tragedy is unemployment. What does EFW tell us to do to create jobs? Or what does the index suggest?
This is our biggest tragedy, and unemployment now, some people speculate, is headed towards 50%, which is almost inconceivable and gives South Africa the highest sustained unemployment rate in the world, I believe. I haven't properly researched that, but I understand that to be true, and is now going higher as a result of lockdown. And I want to break that down slightly so we understand what's going on here. Most of the unemployed people are youth, and their unemployment levels go up to 55, 60%. And most of the youth unemployment is women. Young women are unemployed at the rate of something like 65, even 70%, going up to, because of the lockdown. They previously were at 60 or 65% thereabouts. So the young black in particular, because it is racially significant too, the unemployment amongst black people in South Africa is much higher than amongst white people. And there are all sorts of historical reasons for that. But what we do know is that young black women, the majority, have never had a job, and as things stand, have no chance of ever having a job. Now, this is completely heartrending. This is devastating and terrible. And so the questioner is absolutely right, the journalist. This is our most tragic and biggest problem. And what happens, of course, is these people then eke out a living in the what we call euphemistically the informal sector. The real name for the informal sector is the illegal sector or the criminalized sector, the sector which laws declare to be banned. And this informal sector is where they are. They are busy trading illegally as street traders, backyard operators, doing training, and of course some people doing sexual services, which is the sort of thing they resort to if they really have to. So it really is terrible and tragic. Now, what the World Economic Freedom Index tells you is that if you want full employment, well, the answer is very simple: be a freer economy, because free economies tend to have full or near full employment, regardless of, by the way, how technologically advanced they are. The belief that machinery and technology make people unemployment is disproven by the index, because countries like Switzerland, for example, have almost permanent full employment. Countries like Hong Kong, now Mauritius. So full employment is gained by having a higher score on the Freedom Index, but there are specifics. In other words, it's not saying generally raise the score. What specifically can we do about unemployment? Well, there are really two important things. One is what we know is that you've got to make it attractive to employ people. You've got to make it rewarding. You've got to have lower tax rates. You've got to have less regulation. You've got to make it less costly, less risky, and less difficult to employ unemployed people, especially people without skills and experience. And so you want to make it an investor or employer friendly climate. For that, you need to tweak a few laws, a few measures, and you can, for example, have employment tax deductions and incentives. You can simply have capital investment security, promise people that if they invest, their capital will be safe and not expropriated without compensation, and promise them that they will be able to take all their money out as and when they wish to, bring it in and take it out. In other words, scrap exchange controls. The more direct measures would be the labor laws. The minimum wage law basically says that unless you can find somebody to pay you more than they are willing to pay, you must remain unemployed. The minimum wage law is not a law that governs people with a job or governs people who employ. It is a law that governs people without a job. It prohibits them from getting a job. And so you want to free people under minimum wages, as my colleague Eustace Davey says, give them a job seekers exemption certificate and let them go around and get whatever job if they have been unemployed, for example, for 6 months or a year. And then you can have laws that protect their safety and protect the conditions of employment. But nonetheless, the minimum wage law and other labor laws should be the subject of exemption for the unemployed. They govern people with a job who are fortunate and people who employ who are fortunate. They completely victimize and terrorize the unemployed. So the minimum wage law, the various laws regarding retrenchment and minimum working conditions should all be reviewed. They can remain as they are, frankly. You can even make them tighter and raise the standards, but give exemption from all of those laws to the unemployed.
Thank you, Leon. Another question has come in about the economic devastation caused by COVID-19 and what does the EFW report say about this? I think you've covered in your previous answers. Anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I
Specifically
would
on
like to say
COVID-19?
I didn't cover COVID-19 much, just in passing, but it is probably the worst thing that has happened to the South African economy since, we say, the Great Depression. We never really were impacted as much by the Great Depression as the Great Drought at the time. This is probably the most devastating thing that could be imagined. To reduce the GDP of South Africa by, nobody knows yet what it's going to be, but let's say 15%. What that means is that the country forevermore will be 15% poorer than it would have been, or 20% poorer, whatever the number might be. And no matter how you grow off that lower base. In other words, you can grow, but you are always poorer than you would have been had you started growing without the COVID impact. Now, the COVID impact has the very simple effect, anyone can look it up on the internet, it's very easy, the correlation between GDP per capita and life expectancy, or the mortality rates. And what that shows is quite simple, is that poorer countries have higher death rates, have lower life expectancy rates. And so what the COVID impact will do is literally kill people. People will die by the thousand prematurely as a result of this. And it will, of course, cause all sorts of other devastation. People who've lost everything, their savings, their jobs, their skills, businesses that have gone under, small businesses, the human cost, frankly, the cruelty of the lockdown astonished me. I couldn't understand how any decent human being with any humanity in them could have allowed something like that to happen. There were much simpler ways. The Swedish approach, for example, voluntary behavior to social distance, wear masks, live safely, would have done a better job and would have saved us from this incredible devastation. To recover from this devastation, well, as I say, you never can. You never get back what you've lost. But what you can do is go into a high growth economy. And what EFW, the Economic Freedom of the World Index, tells you is the simple way to do that is to move rapidly the way Mauritius has done, Rwanda is doing, up the index, become rapidly freer and freer. Then we will go into very high growth rates, and the wealth of South Africans will double every 10 years or 15 years. We will start experiencing real prosperity that is fairly easy to achieve by improving our score on the Economic Freedom Index.
Thank you, Leon. If anyone else has questions specifically on COVID, please send them in to us via the Facebook page. And Mark Wade is asking a direct cause of the incompetence, corruption, and racism in government. Mark, if you're listening still, I'm not sure exactly to what that refers, so please send in another message and then Leon can answer it fully. Thank you. Piet Pretorius asks, how come the private sector seems to be paralyzed?
Yes, I am happy to give a bit of a response to that quickly, Mark Wade's question, but you can certainly clarify. But the question of corruption in government and the question of incompetence, this is what the Economic Freedom of the World Index does tell you, is that countries with freer economies have lower scores on the corruption perceptions index, and so that less economic freedom means more corruption. And the reason is very simple, because people in government are spending someone else's money. In the private sector, you don't expect much corruption simply because people are spending their own money. And there is occasionally, of course, as we've seen with people like Steinhoff, there will be fraud, not really corruption or theft or the sort of thing that is kickbacks that we've seen in government. That is a consequence of having a big government, an unfree economy. The other thing is that where there is discretionary power, in other words, somebody decides whether or not you get a taxi license, somebody decides whether or not you get a cell phone license, then you would expect corruption. You would expect people who can hand out favors, licenses, property, housing. You'd expect, for example, the people giving away RDP houses who can decide who do and don't get them. It would be very surprising if there weren't corruption. When you can decide who gets a multi-billion rand contract, it would be very surprising if there weren't corruption. So what you need is checks and balances, and preferably much more private sector where people are spending their own money, not someone else's money.
Thank you, Leon. Mark, if you're still listening and that hasn't answered your question, please let us know. And following on from that, Piet Pretorius is asking, how is it that the private sector seems to be paralyzed in doing anything?
Yes, this is quite frustrating for us in the Free Market Foundation. Many people think we represent the private sector or big business. In fact, most of our work is with the informal sector and small business and people living in shanty towns and in low-income housing and farm settlements and so on. But we have exactly the same rights and protection for big business. We want everyone from the street vendor to a bank to be equally free. And so what business has been is surprising to us, because under apartheid, the business community openly opposed apartheid, openly supported anti-apartheid movements like ourselves and the IRR and others. And now there seems to be a fear of taking on the government. Now, why would that be? I think the answer is very simply that the government is now in a position to victimize businesses. So, for example, we have a friend in the insurance industry, take for example, and he says he doesn't want any connection with us to be known because he is scared of the Market Conduct Authority, that used to be called the Financial Services Board to victimize him, which they can do. They have the power. So government power, government control enables them to victimize the business community on a grand scale. You might recall some years ago, FNB ran an advertisement saying that everybody should unite in fighting crime. For some reason, the government didn't like that because it implied the government wasn't doing it well enough, or some strange reason. I don't think we ever got to know. But they basically just threatened the bank with closing accounts with banks of local governments, provincial governments, central government departments. So every big business, almost every big business, is potentially easily victimized by government. And this could explain why they are, A, so muzzled, and B, when they do say anything, they often sound sycophantishly supporting of government.
That's a good answer. Thank you, Leon. Another question from a journalist. You say people live longer in freer economies. Does that mean that the lost GDP caused by lockdown means you kill more people than the disease, that the operation was a success but the patient died?
Yes, I think this is absolutely correct. The COVID lockdown worked, and the result of that is complete devastation of the economy. And we know that there's a very tight, ratcheted connection or link between GDP per capita, that's the wealth of a country per person, and there's a link between wealth and economic freedom, which means there's a link between economic freedom and life expectancy or mortality. So yes, it does mean that the lockdown probably will have killed, and bearing in mind that it goes on. The lockdown and COVID end hopefully soon, but the lost GDP, the lost wealth, is with us forever. In other words, 10 years from now, there will still be a higher death rate or a lower life expectancy than there would have been had there not been a lockdown. So, in other words, the lockdown kills people year after year after year, or shortens their life expectancy, or kills them prematurely year after year after year, whereas the lockdown hopefully will end soon.
Okay, thank you. How seriously does our government take the EFW report, or at all? Do they consider it? Are they aware of it? Do they listen to it or read it?
They're certainly aware of it. We make sure that all relevant policymakers get it or become aware of it. We do media coverage on it, which is usually quite substantial. We use it in our submissions to government, in many submissions that we make, written and oral. And so many people in government are aware of it. Government is not monolithic. It's not that the government is aware of it or the government isn't. Some people are, and probably most are not. Our government does not pay anything like the attention to it should. Other governments, like the government of Georgia, Rwanda, Mauritius, they pay attention to it, and they then get themselves better scores and move up the index. And governments that ignore it, like, say, Zimbabwe or Venezuela, of course, crash. So the index is really the only way to go. There's no choice. If you do not have a better score, you cannot prosper, you cannot grow. You're condemned to not growing. So the fact that our government doesn't pay it the attention it should comes at the expense of all South Africans. We are all, as a result, poorer than we would have been had the government taken it more seriously than it does. But we do believe that there are people in government who are aware of it and take it seriously, and we work at trying to increase the number.
So you're saying there is a correlation between governments taking this seriously and a higher score on the index?
Yes, yes. If governments, well, let's be clear. We can't say that the governments that have improved their score did so because they studied the index. Many of them might have done it because they just adopted freer market policies. But there is quite a lot of evidence that this is the most referred to and resourced, referenced index of economic systems and policy in the world. We presume many of the people who are referencing it are government advisors and officials and party political advisors and officials. And we know, for example, in South Africa, that some of the political parties do take it seriously, and we encourage them to. So around the world, we cannot say, for example, China creating these fantastic economic free zones did it because they studied economic freedom of the world. It is more probable that they simply looked at Hong Kong and said, let's have a few more Hong Kongs. And they created 5 or 6 Hong Kongs and now 7. And so they just replicated what they saw working. Whether they used economic freedom of the world, we don't know. We know that, for example, the Cato Institute, which is one of our partner organizations, did presentations on it to the Chinese government 20 years ago or so, and they might have been a factor. We hope they were. We assume they were. That's why we do our work, because making government more aware of economic freedom of the world hopefully will encourage it to adopt better policies.
And as we all know, South Africa desperately needs international investment, investment from international players as well as local. Do investors tend to pay attention? Do they pay attention to this report? Is it widely used with for FDI?
Again, some investors, we know, for example, that one of the world's most celebrated and successful investors, Jim Rogers, looked at the report, could see that China was moving in the right direction, at least in the special zones and places like Shanghai. China, by the way, is highly federalized, so some of the provinces of China are amongst the least free places on earth, and some of them are amongst the freest places on earth. China is not one single situation. We are accustomed in South Africa to assuming one size fits all. China has enormous internal diversity. And he, for example, looked at it and looks at it and is familiar with it and decides which countries in the world to invest in. His investment strategy, as one of the world's most successful investors ever, multi-billionaire, is that he looks at which countries are becoming more free, and then he invests in them. He doesn't really care what he invests in, anything. He'll buy just random shares on the stock market, random pieces of property. He did that in Botswana, by the way, 25 years ago. He saw Botswana had a freer economy and was becoming more free. He drove across to Botswana on his motorbike and bought some land and investments there, and they are amongst his highest return. So some investors do. I should imagine many don't. But what investors do, whether or not they study the index, is if countries are becoming more free, if they're moving up the index, even if the investors don't know that fact, they pick it up, they sense it. They sense the places that are becoming more free, and that is where they go and invest. And they are more interested in the direction of movement than in the actual score, which itself is quite interesting. In other words, countries that have been free for a long time tend to have the investment they're going to get, and they tend to grow and be stable. The countries that start moving, like Rwanda or Mauritius, they experience takeoff. They experience a flood of investors who come in simply because there's more economic freedom. Whether they know that because they look at the index, we don't know.
That's a very valuable comment. Thank you, and an important message out to government and all political parties. David Ford is asking, what can ordinary South Africans who believe in free market capitalism do to contribute to a more economically free society?
Oh, well, lots, of course. Just an important thing is writing letters to newspapers. People don't realize that they are one of the most highly read parts of newspapers. even more than the leader articles, the opinion pieces, the various columns, and so on. So what you can do is write letters. They are very important. And don't write letters to the obvious ones. Write letters to ones where there are people you might want to reach. The unconverted. You can either be a preacher who preaches to the converted through, say, Business Day or Business Leadership, or you can be a a missionary who preaches to the unconverted, largely through, for example, the Sowetan or City Press or whatever. And by saying their readers are converted or unconverted, I want to qualify that I simply don't know. I just think that the readers of Business Day are more likely already to be pro-capitalist and free market than the readers of, say, the Sowetan. But maybe I'm wrong, because readers of Sowetan might well be in small business and actually more pro-free market than readers of Business Day. We don't know, but I would say that's important. The other thing is support organizations that promote free market values, the obvious one being the Free Market Foundation. Join it, give us money. And what you could do, for example, is consider a small, modest, monthly stop order. And then support us both in cash and kind. You might become involved in our work. That would be a sort of thing you could do. And then other organizations aren't the only ones. There are other organizations that promote economic freedom, and we work with them, and you can become involved with them. So if I may say, the one that I can assure you your money will be well and efficiently invested in, and your support will be effective, is the Free Market Foundation. We're nearly 50 years old and one of the world's most famous policy think tanks, and have, we hope, a very big rate of return for investors, or bang for the buck, as they would say in America.
Yes, thank you. A question from William Horn from Media24. The latest index is for 2018. What does the FMF expect the direction of South Africa's movement on the index being forward to 2020, given the COVID-19 lockdown and government's severely deteriorating fiscal position?
Yes, thanks for that question. That's a very, very important question, because the numbers in the index are 2018. And the reason is that's the data that's available. Data that goes into the index is usually available 2 years later, 1 to 2 years later. So the index is always measuring the past by a year or two. So 2018 is therefore the year in which we had a slight movement towards greater economic freedom. And what is going to happen, I should imagine, in forthcoming indices, bearing in mind next year's index will be 2019, and thereafter we will get the index that covers the COVID period. And I would be very surprised if the South African index doesn't take a plunge because of the increased government spending, increased government debt, increased government regulation. However, I do want to qualify by saying that the President Ramaphosa has said that they are going to look at structural economic reforms to bring about growth and prosperity. They might well do that. We will certainly encourage them to. And if they do, I'm not a betting man. Would I bet on them doing this and reversing the impact of COVID or not? I don't know, but I think there's a fairly good chance that they will listen to reason and embark on some quite far-reaching policies that would take us towards greater economic freedom. And that'll be things like winding up failed state-owned enterprises, allowing competition in energy, all sorts of other policies which they are talking about and considering. If they do embark on those, we might find, strangely enough, that the COVID episode or impact becomes some kind of long-term blessing in disguise, gets South Africa, shakes us up, says, look, this is ridiculous, stop these contrarian and countervailing policies, start adopting pro-market policies and move in the right direction. That could be the result. It is said humoristically that we should not make predictions, especially not about the future, or the future is not what it used to be. Well, based on this year's COVID experience and lockdown, the future certainly isn't what it used to be. We cannot extrapolate what we might have done with economic freedom of the world into the year 2020, and we'll have to see. But certainly we can, it is an opportunity for us to influence the course of events very positively. So in the crisis, there's an opportunity. It is said that the Chinese symbol for crisis is a combination of the words danger and opportunity. And so the problem we have brings with it an opportunity.
But you're saying if the government doesn't do anything or introduce freedom policies, more free policies, then the lag is about 2 years, the time lag for us to see the results of COVID on the economy.
Yes, on the economic freedom index, we will see that. We'll see the impact on the economy immediately. We see it right now. We know it. But how it will influence the score, I don't know. Just bearing in mind that during the total lockdown, there was zero economic freedom. In other words, the freedom index would have plunged from above 6 to 0, or almost 0 to 1 or so on the index out of 10. And so whether that will show up, I don't know. I don't know whether the indices that are going to be produced will actually bring that into account. Even now, the index has to be much below what it would normally be because of the restrictions on economic freedom. And so we will have had a year of much less economic freedom, as has every country virtually in the world. Most countries have had much less economic freedom. A few, like Sweden and New Zealand, have maintained their levels of economic freedom. A few African countries have. But what we should see is a very precipitous drop for 1 year, the year 2020, when the index comes out. Maybe they will make some kind of adjustment for that. I don't know. The World Bank and the IMF and the World Economic Forum and others, the Country Risk Guide, the Freedom Institute that does the Freedom Index, all of these may well make some adjustment. In other words, to not make the lockdowns around the world look somewhat ridiculous. You know, if for 1 year all systems in the world plunge to virtually zero, that'll look odd. So I don't know whether they will make an adjustment. They might feel obligated to.
You say we all know the impact that COVID has had on the economy in general. So we'll wait and see for the index. Another question has come in about our peer groups, our peer countries. Why are some BRICS countries with lower scores than South Africa, outperforming us?
Yes, this is, I did touch on it. Let me elaborate. The one that is outperforming us spectacularly and outperforming virtually every country in the world is, of course, China. And the reason for that is very simple, that China, firstly, was 25 years ago one of the least free economies on earth and has been moving up the index. Now, when I say China is moving up the index, you must understand that's China on average. What has happened in China is not only has it moved up the index, and moving up is more important than where you are. In other words, if you're less free than South Africa, but becoming more free, you will outperform South Africa, unless South Africa also becomes more free. The big thing in China, the huge thing in China that has completely changed China is the creation of one country, two systems. The Hong Kong is the freest and wealthiest place on earth, one of the wealthiest, but certainly the freest, and has been year after year, and is part of China. So there you have the freest economy on earth is part of China. China, on average, has a low score. How that works, I don't know. In other words, how does the position in Hong Kong get fed into the aggregate China index? Then China has these 6 special economic zones, which are very big places, the size, for example, of Gauteng. And these special economic zones are the freest economies on planet Earth. They don't even know what the balance of payments is in these places. The data are not kept. Money moves freely in and out. Skills move freely in and out. People move freely in and out. There's no such thing as a minimum wage law. The only thing they manage to do is enforce contracts, and they do that ruthlessly the way you'd expect communists to do if they want to enforce contracts. That's China. India is the same. India is also creating special economic zones. It has been embarking on a program of privatization and deregulation, for example, in the energy field. So there are parts of India now where you can buy electricity from two suppliers, a high grade and a low grade, high cost, low cost supplier. And they are freely competing. It's free to anyone can go into the energy business in India. And there are many others. India used to have very severe restrictions on foreign investment. They have been largely relaxed. So India is again moving up the index. But like China, probably the biggest thing in India is these special zones which they've been creating. Hyderabad, for example, is well known for its internet and tech zone status. And so what happens is that these zones, which are the freest places on earth into which all the investment goes, do not appear, as far as I can tell, to go into the average country score. So say, for example, South Africa has a free zone at Kucha, which is totally free. There's no exchange control, no labor law, no licensing law. People can completely laissez-faire capitalism. Then will that impact the average score for South Africa? Probably not. What the World Bank and others will look at is what happens in the rest of South Africa, not in the free zone. So that probably explains India as well. Brazil was moving up rapidly and started moving down, and as a result has contracted and got higher inflation and lower growth. So Brazil did what we did. It was moving in the right direction and booming, and then turned around and started contracting. And then above us is Russia. Russia was, of course, fully communist, one of the least free places on earth, and has now overtaken South Africa and is a freer economy than South Africa. So again, moving in the right direction seems to explain higher growth. But the two great performers are China and India, and they seem to be explained by China. Well, India adopted what were called the reforms. That's as they were called in something like 1996, I think it was. I can't remember the date. Maybe 1992, actually earlier. That's when India abandoned socialism, adopted capitalism, and ever since then it has been moving towards a freer economy with very high growth rates. So India formally adopted a capitalistic philosophy and formally embarked on a path of freeing up the economy and has been catching up to South Africa and will soon overtake us.
Very interesting. Another question, Leon, from Jacques Jonker, who is the Free Foundation's chief economist and within the legal policy group as well. He asks, how did the threat of expropriation without compensation affect our ratings? Was that taken into account? And if so, how did it?
Well, Jacques, of course, is an excellent person who could himself probably answer. I wouldn't have minded asking him that question. But as far as I know, it was not taken into account. And the reason is because we don't yet have it. It's still a proposed policy, so that if the constitutional amendment is passed, whether that alone will cause our index score to fall, I don't know. But I should imagine what they would need is actual expropriations without compensation to take place. Now, they're not likely to pick up the fact that they are taking place. They're taking place not against the people you might expect, the rich white farmers or the rich white business people. They're taking place against the poor. There's a bill before Parliament at the moment, the Upgrading of Land Tenure Rights Amendment Bill, which proposes basically taking without compensation the land of something like probably 5 million low-income black South Africans. In other words, the government is proposing expropriation without compensation on a vast scale, much worse than ever happened under apartheid, and it hasn't yet happened. So I think, Jacques, probably what would have to happen is that we are fighting it, as you well know, and if we succeed, or even if we fail and the property is not taken without compensation, then maybe the index won't be adjusted. I'm not sure how they do that. I don't know to what extent they take into account policies and laws as opposed to action. I think what they look at is the fact. In other words, what is the proportion of land in the private sector? How much property, how secure are property rights of companies? Just incidentally, expropriation without compensation is thought by most people to apply to land. It applies to all property, everything, your house, your car, your jewelry, your shares, your investments, your pension. If that amendment goes through, the state will be able to take without compensation absolutely anything it wishes. And it's not yet a law. And I would imagine that the World Bank and others would need to see it actually happening before they lower our score on the index.
Thank you, Leon. That's a comprehensive answer. So basically, we wait and see. A final question, I think. But if there are more questions, send them in so that Leon can answer them. But a final question that I have at the moment is, you talked about the growth rate of 7% being a significant number. Can you explain that, please?
Yes, 7%, or the rule of seven, although I think it's technically the rule of 72 or something, according to mathematicians or accountants. But simply put, the rule of seven is that if something increases at 7% per annum, compounded, it doubles every 10 years. Conversely, if something grows at 10%, it doubles every 7 years. And then it's roughly similar sort of ratios below. If you grow at 1%, you double every 70 years or so. In other words, a lifetime, 70 years and 10 at 1%. So the rate at which South Africa has been growing would take us 70 years, a full lifespan, to double our wealth, to double our GDP or the average person's living standards or income. If we grow at 7% instead of 1%, that will happen not in 70 years, but in 10 years. And if we grow at 10%, the way China has been doing in many years, their wealth doubles every 7 years. So, the period it takes a person to get through school or secondary school or primary school. So, yes, so the rule of seven is really magical. And just always say to yourself, if you can grow at 7%, which is easy for the country to do by having economic freedom, then we will, had we done so since 1994, we would now be at something like $28,000 per person instead of between $5,000 and $6,000 per person. So we would have been, instead of one of the country's so-called developing countries. By the way, when I was young, such countries were called underdeveloped countries. They decided to be more charitable and call them developing. But underdeveloped countries, instead of being one of them, we would have been one of the developed countries, one of the wealthy countries. We would have had complete elimination of shacks, shanty towns, unemployment, poverty. None of these things would be afflicting us had we grown at 7% for a generation for 25, 26 years.
Thank you. That sheds light on the rule of seven. And now I've come to the end of the questions that I have been sent. If anybody has anything they would Leon to answer online now, please quickly send them in. Otherwise, members of the media, thank you very much. Well, thanks to all who've joined, but particularly members of the media. If you would like interviews with Leon today or tomorrow, please let me know, and we can arrange that by Skype or phone. The link to the full report is in the invitation and the media release that you have been sent. So you can get, these are the highlights that we've been going through this morning, but the full report. Or send a message to me and I'll do that. So now the link is live on the Free Market Foundation's YouTube channel. You should be able to see it, view it from now. And otherwise, Leon, thank you very much for over an hour of talking and explanation. That's it's very good. And to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for hosting, and thank you for viewers and the media.
Thanks. Bye-bye.